The Imperial Japanese Navy anchored their ships at Truk Atoll for one simple reason. They believed this massive, reef-enclosed lagoon was completely impenetrable. For years, it stood as the Gibraltar of the Pacific, a sprawling forward base protecting the fleet as it projected power across the ocean. But in just 48 hours, dozens of those vessels would be left burning or resting on the ocean floor. The Americans didn't just destroy ships. They systematically destroyed the very idea that Truk could ever remain a safe haven. Yet, a closer look at the American target reveals a baffling mystery right before the attack even began. To understand the scale of what was about to happen, you have to look at what Truk actually was. This wasn't just a tropical anchorage, it was an operational juggernaut, a protective ring of natural coral reefs stretched for miles, sheltering a deep, calm lagoon that could seamlessly hold the largest warships in the world. Inside that perimeter sat a sprawling, highly organized network of military infrastructure. There were bustling airfields carved into the small islands, massive fuel depots holding the lifeblood of the Pacific campaign, and extensive repair facilities designed to patch up combat damage and keep the fleet in the fight. When the American Fast Carrier Strike Force, Task Force 58, steamed toward this atoll in mid-February 1944, the stage was perfectly set for a long-awaited clash of titans. The United States was throwing unprecedented combat power at the ultimate stronghold, fully expecting a dramatic, decisive showdown. The anticipated goal was to wipe out the mighty Japanese battleships, heavy cruisers, and fleet carriers that had dominated the ocean since the war began. American aviators in their ready rooms were briefed to hunt down the imposing giants of the Imperial Japanese Navy. But there was a massive catch. Days before the American Armada even arrived, the Japanese High Command realized their impenetrable fortress was dangerously exposed. Acting quietly and swiftly, they ordered a strategic evacuation. The ultimate prizes, the capital ships, the heavy carriers, the massive dreadnoughts, weighed anchor, slipped out of the lagoon, and escaped westward to the safer waters of Palau. When the first waves of American aircraft roared over the atoll, the primary enemy warships they had come to destroy were simply not there. The United States was launching the most daring and complex raid of the war against a heavily defended fortress, only to find the heaviest targets missing. By traditional naval logic, swinging at an empty anchorage should have been a strategic disappointment, which leaves a profound question. If the dreadnoughts and the heavy carriers had already safely escaped, why did this 48-hour strike still become one of the most crippling catastrophes the Japanese Navy ever faced? To answer that question, you have to strip away the romance of naval warfare and look at the brutal, unglamorous math of how a modern fleet actually functions. We often picture naval supremacy as a heavily armored battleship firing thunderous broadsides, or a sleek aircraft carrier launching waves of fighters into the wind. But a battleship is essentially a massive, floating consumer of resources. It produces nothing on its own. Every time it turns its massive screws, it burns through staggering quantities of heavy bunker fuel. Every time its radar spins, its guns pivot, or its thousands of crew members eat a meal, it drains a strictly finite reserve. An aircraft carrier, for all its lethal, over-the-horizon reach, is effectively useless the moment it runs out of highly volatile aviation gas or precision spare engine parts. Without a continuous, uninterrupted umbilical cord of supplies, a dreadnought is just 60,000 tons of dead steel drifting aimlessly on the ocean current. The Second World War in the Pacific was not fought in isolated, chivalrous duels between warships. It was a sprawling, mechanized clash of industrial ecosystems. The true measure of a navy's endurance wasn't just the thickness of its armor belts or the caliber of its main battery, but the resilience and efficiency of its supply lines. To keep the Imperial Japanese Navy's combined fleet operational thousands of miles away from the factories of the home islands, an invisible empire of logistics had to be meticulously maintained. This required hundreds of specialized auxiliary vessels. There were deep-draft colliers hauling coal, fleet oilers carrying tens of thousands of tons of combustible crude, refrigerated provision ships holding rations, dedicated submarine tenders, repair ships equipped with floating foundries, and heavy ammunition ships packed to the brim with oxygen torpedoes and armor-piercing artillery shells. These were the true workhorses of the empire. They were slow, lightly armed, heavily laden, and rarely made the headlines, but they were the absolute lifeblood of Japan's war machine. Without them, the empire's defensive perimeter instantly collapses, and Truk Atoll was the beating heart pumping that lifeblood across the Central and South Pacific. By early 1944, this massive lagoon was not just a parking lot for idle warships. It was the primary distribution node for the entire oceanic front. The cargo ships, often requisitioned civilian merchant vessels, known collectively as maras, would make the perilous, agonizingly slow journey from Japan, navigating through submarine-infested waters to anchor safely inside Truk's protective coral ring. Once there, they formed a massive floating warehouse district. Cranes and winches worked around the clock, transferring crude oil from massive tankers into the nimble fleet oilers that would accompany the strike forces. Ammunition was carefully offloaded into subterranean bunkers carved into the islands, or loaded directly into the magazines of waiting heavy cruisers. Spare aircraft engines and fuselage panels, brought in by transport, were ferried to the atoll's multiple airstrips to replace those burned out or shot up in combat. Truk was the central nervous system, physically connecting the industrial output of Tokyo and Osaka to the distant, bleeding battlefronts of the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. When the Japanese High Command realized that the American advance was accelerating through the Marshall Islands, they made the cold, pragmatic calculation to save their irreplaceable capital ships by ordering them westward to Palau. But a logistical hub of Truk's sheer magnitude cannot simply pack up its bags and slip away under the cover of darkness. You cannot instantly relocate hundreds of thousands of tons of aviation fuel, heavy machinery, and dry stores. More importantly, the auxiliary fleet, the dozens of transports, merchantmen, and vital support vessels currently anchored in the lagoon, lacked the raw horsepower to outrun an impending carrier strike. While the sleek cruisers and destroyers could raise steam and sprint out of the channels at 30 knots, the heavily laden maras struggled to make 10 or 12. They were physically tethered to the atoll, desperately trying to offload their vital cargo or anxiously awaiting organized escorts to disperse them back into the open ocean. The capital ships had escaped the trap, but the very infrastructure that allowed those capital ships to exist in the first place was left behind, sitting squarely in the crosshairs. Steaming relentlessly toward this highly vulnerable nerve center was the United States Navy's Fast Carrier Task Force 58. Under the overarching command of Admiral Raymond Spruance and tactically directed by Vice Admiral Marc Mitscher, this was the most lethal assembly of naval aviation the world had ever seen up to that moment. The task force was an armada of heavy fleet carriers, light carriers, brand new fast battleships, and a sprawling screen of cruisers and destroyers that stretched across the horizon. But far more dangerous than their sheer numbers was a fundamental, ruthless shift in American targeting philosophy. The young aviators in the ready rooms were initially hungry for the glory of sinking a famous battleship, but the strategic commanders pacing the flag bridges understood a deeper, colder truth of the Pacific War. If you sink a battleship, you remove one dangerous piece from the board. If you annihilate the enemy's auxiliary fleet and supply infrastructure, you paralyze the entire board. The tension in mid-February 1944 was no longer about whether Spruance and Mitscher would catch the Japanese heavy hitters sleeping at anchor. The stakes had fundamentally changed. It became a high-stakes race against time to sever the logistical arteries of the Japanese Empire before those specialized merchant ships could scatter into the vastness of the Pacific, and before the stockpiled fuel and spare parts could be dispersed to other, harder-to-reach bases. The American planners knew through intercepted intelligence that Japan's shipbuilding industry was already buckling under the immense strain of a multi-front war. The shipyards back home could barely replace their frontline destroyers, let alone the specialized civilian merchant tonnage being steadily ground down by American submarines. If Task Force 58 could catch and trap this specific concentration of Maris, fleet oilers, and repair ships inside Truk's enclosed lagoon, they could inflict a strategic wound that no amount of armor plating could ever heal. It was about permanently blinding and crippling the enemy's capacity to project naval power. Let's look closer at what was actually anchored in the turquoise waters of the lagoon as the American fleet rapidly closed the distance. There were specialized submarine tenders sitting at anchor, essentially floating hotels and highly advanced machine shops that allowed Japanese attack subs to remain on patrol for months without the grueling transit back to the home islands. Destroy just one of these tenders, and you effectively pull a dozen lethal submarines off the front line. There were water condensers, critical for turning raw seawater into the purified boiler feed water required for the older, steam-powered vessels of the fleet. There were dedicated aircraft ferries, engineered specifically to transport delicate, unassembled Zero fighters and dive bombers to the forward airfields without exposing them to salt spray. Every single auxiliary vessel sitting in that anchorage represented a specific, highly technical, and deeply irreplaceable capability. The Japanese Naval Command on the islands knew exactly how exposed these assets were. The frantic, nervous energy in the days leading up to the strike was not focused on preparing for a glorious, decisive fleet action, but on the desperate, grinding, exhausting labor of moving cargo. Winches screamed continuously. Small, shallow-draft boats scurried frantically between the anchored giants, and sweat-drenched supply crews worked through the oppressive tropical heat to empty the holds of the merchantmen. They were trying to save the material, trying to empty the ships so they could run. But time, the one absolute resource they could not manufacture or stockpile, had simply run out. The pressure was immense on both sides of the horizon, driving a wedge of anxiety through both fleets. For the Japanese, the creeping dread was rooted in the undeniable knowledge that their defensive perimeter was cracking much faster than they could ever patch it. The Marshall Islands had just fallen to amphibious assault. The American fleet was suddenly operating with a boldness and speed that bordered on absolute impunity. The commanders at Truk were staring at a fatal bottleneck. They had too many ships, too much vital cargo, and far too few destroyers to organize a mass, protected convoy to safety. Every single hour that passed with the auxiliary fleet still anchored heavily in the lagoon was an hour closer to a systemic disaster. For the Americans, the pressure was about maximizing a highly volatile strike window. The weather in the Central Pacific could be notoriously fickle, capable of grounding flight operations without warning, and operating massive carrier task forces this deep inside hostile enemy territory carried severe inherent risks. The longer Task Force 58 lingered in the waters near Truk, the higher the mathematical probability of being discovered by reconnaissance planes and targeted by land-based bombers launching from other overlapping Japanese strongholds. They had a brutally narrow, 48-hour operational window to execute the strike and withdraw. They had to strike fast, they had to strike hard, and they had to completely wipe the lagoon clean of its industrial capacity. But simply flying over a sprawling 40-mile-wide anchorage and dropping bombs at random would not achieve the kind of total, systemic collapse the American commanders demanded. To permanently blind the base and successfully sever the logistical arteries of the empire, brute force alone was entirely insufficient. The intricate network of island airfields, early warning radar stations, massive fuel depots, and the ships themselves were deeply interlocked and mutually supporting. If the airfields remained operational, the slow transports could be defended by interceptors. If the anti-aircraft batteries were left intact, the American dive bombers would take unsustainable losses. Taking down a logistical hub of this magnitude, one heavily protected by a ring of coral and a formidable garrison, required a completely new, meticulously surgical approach to destruction. That meticulously surgical approach began in the pre-dawn darkness of February 17, 1944. Long before the sun crested the Pacific horizon, the flight decks of Task Force 58 were already roaring with the sound of radial engines. At 0645, the radar screens on the Japanese installations at Truk began to paint a terrifying picture. The incoming bogies were not arriving in a disorganized swarm, but in a highly choreographed, deliberate first wave. Over 70 F-6F Hellcat fighters swept in low over the coral reef, completely bypassing the anchored ships and the hardened concrete bunkers. Their mission was singular and utterly ruthless: to blind the atoll before it could even throw a punch. The Japanese had over 300 aircraft stationed across the crushed coral runways of Eton, Moen, and Param Islands. If those planes could get airborne in time, they could form a lethal defensive umbrella over the lagoon, forcing the American bombers into a costly, protracted battle of attrition. The Hellcats ensured that never happened. In a chaotic, fast-paced aerial melee, the heavily armed American fighters aggressively dismantled the airborne Japanese combat air patrol. The Mitsubishi Zeros that did manage to claw their way into the morning sky were quickly overwhelmed by the sheer volume of synchronized firepower and the disciplined, interlocking tactics of the American aviators. Within minutes, the battle transitioned from a dogfight into an execution. With the skies temporarily cleared of interceptors, the Hellcats plummeted toward the island airfields, strafing the neatly parked rows of Japanese bombers and fighters that were still desperately warming up their engines on the tarmac. Tracers ripped through fragile aluminum airframes. Aviation fuel ignited, sending thick, greasy plumes of black smoke into the humid, tropical air. By mid-morning, the United States Navy had achieved absolute, uncontested air superiority over the Gibraltar of the Pacific. The protective canopy over Truk had been permanently shattered. With the sky secured, the main strike packages arrived. Wave after relentless wave of SBD Dauntless dive bombers, SB-2C Helldivers, and TBF Avenger torpedo planes darkened the horizon. For the Japanese commanders watching from the reinforced bunkers on Dublon Island, this was the moment of anticipated devastation. Traditional military doctrine dictated that this massive influx of heavy ordnance would naturally gravitate toward the anti-aircraft batteries, the coastal defense guns, or the remaining destroyers frantically maneuvering in the anchorage. It was assumed the Americans would try to suppress the military defenses first in order to survive the airspace. But as the American bombers rolled over into their steep, screaming dives, a chilling realization washed over the Japanese defenders. The Americans were actively ignoring the military defenses. The crosshairs were not fixed on armored gun emplacements or combat vessels. Instead, the strike aircraft ruthlessly shifted their focus to the unglamorous, highly vulnerable targets desperately trying to raise steam in the harbor. They initiated a methodical slaughter of the logistical fleet. Heavy, armor-piercing bombs smashed through the thin steel decks of the transport Maris, detonating deep within holds packed with irreplaceable engine parts, artillery shells, and dry stores. Torpedo planes skimmed just feet above the turquoise water, actively avoiding the shallow draft of the escort ships to unleash their payloads into the deep, sluggish hulls of the fleet oilers. When a torpedo struck an oiler, the result was not a conventional sinking, but a catastrophic eruption of boiling crude and aviation gas that instantly incinerated the vessel, spreading a lake of fire across the surface of the lagoon. This was not a chaotic brawl. It was a deliberate, industrial-scale dismantling. The Japanese engineers and merchant captains trapped aboard these vessels understood immediately that they were not collateral damage. They were the primary objective. The American aviators flew with a cold, terrifying discipline, picking apart the anchorage sector by sector. They struck the specialized ammunition vessels, triggering secondary explosions so massive they registered like seismic events, sending shockwaves across the water that shattered windows miles away. They targeted the island fuel reserves, dropping incendiaries onto the massive oil tanks that represented the lifeblood of the combined fleet. The very infrastructure that made Truk valuable was being systematically erased. By the afternoon of February 17th, the psychological reality of the American strategy had fully set in. The Japanese High Command had spent years fortifying this atoll to keep the enemy out, but those exact same geographic defenses, the narrow, easily bottlenecked passes through the coral reef, now worked perfectly to keep their own auxiliary ships in. The slow transports and tenders could not outrun the aircraft, and they could not hide in the deep water. The protective shield of Truk had been completely stripped away, leaving the vital logistical fleet locked inside a massive, burning cage with absolutely no way out. For the Japanese commanders standing on the balconies of the concrete headquarters on Dublin Island, the immediate aftermath of the morning strike offered a brief, deceptive illusion. As the last American dive bombers pulled out of their runs and shrank into the eastern sky, a grim sense of familiarity settled over the anchorage. Fires raged across the decks of merchant ships, and a thick, toxic layer of crude oil was already beginning to coat the turquoise water of the lagoon. But the prevailing assumption was that the worst was over. Naval doctrine in the Pacific, up to this point in the war, followed a strict, almost predictable rhythm. Carrier raids were inherently fragile operations. A task force would steam in under the cover of darkness, launch a single, massive, coordinated strike at dawn, and immediately turn their bows into the wind to flee before enemy land-based bombers could pinpoint their location. The Japanese garrison officers immediately began issuing orders for damage control. Sirens wailed across the coral atolls. Firefighting teams were dispatched to the burning oilers. Medical personnel rushed to the docks to receive the wounded. The overarching belief was that they simply needed to patch the bleeding, restore the runways, and wait for the Americans to retreat over the horizon. They fundamentally misunderstood what was sitting just off their coast. Task Force 58 had not come to raid Truk. They had come to dismantle it. Far out on the Pacific swells, Vice Admiral Marc Mitscher was not ordering his fleet to withdraw. He was utilizing a rotational deck cycling system that the Japanese had never witnessed on this scale. With 9 fast carriers at his disposal, Mitscher could stagger his flight operations. While one carrier division was launching aircraft, another was recovering them, and a third was striking enemy targets. They had turned the open ocean into a relentless industrial conveyor belt of destruction. Just as the Japanese repair crews were beginning to contain the fires on the anchored freighters, the early warning radar stations on Moen Island picked up a new cluster of contacts. It was not a straggling squadron. It was a second, fully loaded strike package, just as massive as the first. The illusion of a hit-and-run raid shattered instantly. The ensuing 48 hours devolved into a continuous, unbroken siege. The psychological toll of this unrelenting pressure was catastrophic. For the civilian mariners and auxiliary captains aboard the remaining transport ships, the realization that the Americans were not leaving triggered a wave of absolute desperation. Staying at anchor inside the lagoon was no longer a calculated risk. It was a guaranteed death sentence. A stationary 10,000-ton cargo ship was an unmissable target for an American dive bomber, dropping a 1,000-pound armor-piercing weapon. The only mathematical chance of survival was to get underway, raise steam, and break out into the open ocean. But a 1920s-era requisitioned merchant vessel cannot start its engines with the turn of a key. Building enough boiler pressure to move thousands of tons of steel requires hours of grueling, deafening labor in the sweltering heat of the engine room. Stokers and engineers worked frantically in the dark, vibrating bellies of the ships, listening to the muffled, terrifying concussions of bombs detonating in the water just outside their steel hulls. When the pressure gauges finally crept into the red, Many captains didn't even waste the precious minutes required to winch up their heavy anchor chains. They ordered the chains cut. Massive steel links plunged into the coral as the sluggish auxiliary ships desperately began to churn the water, attempting to build momentum. The lagoon became a chaotic, smoke-choked nightmare of maneuver. Dozens of heavy, unwieldy vessels were trying to navigate a confined body of water simultaneously, zigzagging to throw off the aim of incoming torpedo bombers, while desperately trying to avoid colliding with the burning wrecks of ships that had already been sunk. But Truk Atoll is a geographic prison, the sprawling protective ring of the coral reef, which successfully kept heavy ocean swells and enemy surface ships out, now perfectly funneled the escaping Japanese fleet into a handful of narrow, highly predictable choke points. To reach the open ocean, the fleeing ships had to thread the needle through the North Pass or the South Pass, deep water channels barely wide enough for two large vessels to pass side by side. The American aviators orbiting above immediately recognized this desperate migration. They didn't have to hunt the ships across the 40-mile lagoon. They simply had to wait at the exits. SBD Dauntless and SB-2C Helldiver squadrons began targeting the passes, creating lethal bottlenecks. A single bomb tearing through the engine room of a freighter in the middle of the channel could effectively trap everything behind it. Yet, against overwhelming odds, a handful of Japanese captains managed to navigate the gauntlet. Bruised, battered, and trailing smoke, a procession of light cruisers, destroyers, and vital merchantmen successfully squeezed through the coral channels and burst out into the deep blue water of the Pacific. For the exhausted crews standing on the decks of those escaping ships, the sight of the open ocean must have felt like salvation. If they could just put enough nautical miles between themselves and the burning atoll, they could melt into the vastness of the sea under the cover of the approaching night. But Admiral Raymond Spruance had not merely thrown a blanket of aircraft over the lagoon. He had cast an impenetrable, multi-layered net over hundreds of square miles of ocean. The trap extended far beyond the reef. Waiting silently in the deep, cold waters just beyond the coral drop-offs was the United States Navy's submarine force. For days, American fleet submarines had been quietly vectoring into position, setting up an overlapping ambush grid around every logical exit route from the atoll. Through the lenses of their attack periscopes, American submarine commanders watched the distant, towering columns of black smoke rising from Truk. They didn't need sonar to find the enemy. The Japanese ships were frantically driving themselves directly into the crosshairs. As the surviving transports and their frantic escorts cleared the reef, believing they had finally escaped the terror of the sky, the ocean simply tore open beneath them. The submarines unleashed spreads of Mark 14 torpedoes. By early 1944, the infamous magnetic exploder defects that had plagued the American submarine fleet early in the war had finally been resolved. The torpedoes ran true, and they detonated with devastating reliability. The escaping Japanese ships were struck directly in their most vulnerable points, below the waterline, where no amount of deck armor could save them. Escort destroyers, desperately trying to hunt the submerged predators, found themselves outmaneuvered by the silent, unseen American boats. The psychological horror for the Japanese sailors was absolute. They had survived a relentless aerial bombardment, navigated a treacherous coral bottleneck, and escaped into the open sea, only to find that the ocean itself was rigged to kill them. And for those few, incredibly lucky vessels that managed to slip past the submarine screen, an even more terrifying reality awaited. Admiral Spruance, a commander known for his cold, calculating thoroughness, was not content to leave the perimeter to chance. In a highly unusual tactical maneuver, Spruance detached a heavily armed surface action group from the carrier screen. Task Group 50.9, built around the brand-new, ultra-fast Iowa-class battleships, heavy cruisers, and a screen of destroyers, began a high-speed patrol around the outer perimeter of the atoll. Spruance personally directed this surface sweep, effectively wrapping a wall of advanced radar-directed naval artillery around the entire theater of operations. When a small group of Japanese ships, including the light cruiser Katori and the armed merchant cruiser Akagi Maru, managed to clear the North Pass and evade the submarines, they found themselves staring at the unmistakable, towering superstructures of the most advanced battleships on Earth. There was no battle, it was an execution. The American radar systems effortlessly pierced the lingering smoke and haze, feeding precise firing solutions to massive 16-inch guns. The Japanese optical rangefinders were entirely useless against the sheer range and mathematical precision of the American artillery. The Katori was systematically disassembled by heavy-caliber shellfire, plunging into the depths alongside the transports she was attempting to escort. The encirclement was absolute. The American fleet had turned a 40-mile radius of the Pacific into a sealed, closed-loop system of destruction. Nothing was allowed to leave. Back inside the lagoon, the systematic slaughter of the logistical fleet reached its grim conclusion. The Americans were not just sinking steel. They were meticulously, surgically removing the specialized organs of the Japanese naval ecosystem. They identified and destroyed the water-condensing ships, vessels explicitly designed to provide the millions of gallons of purified water required to keep the boilers of the older battleships from calcifying and exploding. They hunted down the dedicated submarine tenders like the Heian Maru, massive floating workshops filled with heavy lathes, precision milling machines, and racks of highly volatile oxygen torpedoes. When a bomb penetrated the deck of a tender, it didn't just kill the ship, it destroyed the capacity to refit and rearm an entire submarine squadron for the next 6 months. Perhaps the most devastating, yet entirely invisible loss, was the human capital. Standing on the shores of Eton and Dublin Islands, hundreds of highly specialized Japanese naval mechanics, aviation engineers, and torpedo technicians watched helplessly as the ships carrying their tools, their workshops, and their life's work burned to the waterline. These were not replaceable infantrymen. These were men who had spent a decade mastering the intricate calibration of optical rangefinders, the delicate assembly of aircraft radial engines, and the highly dangerous maintenance of the Type 93 long-lance torpedo. They were the master craftsmen of the Empire's war machine. Without their specialized ships, they were instantly rendered useless. The United States Navy had effectively stranded the most valuable technical minds of the Imperial Japanese Navy on a remote tropical island with nothing left to repair. By the time the sun began to set on the second day, the Gibraltar of the Pacific had been reduced to a nautical graveyard. Nearly 40 ships lay in the mud at the bottom of the lagoon, representing roughly 200,000 tons of merchant, transport, and vital auxiliary shipping. The water was choked with debris. The air was thick with the suffocating stench of burning rubber and heavy fuel oil, and the operational capacity of the base had been completely erased. But sinking these ships in the lagoon was only half the disaster. The true catastrophe was what those sunken hulls represented to the rest of the empire. The devastating nature of this attack was not simply a matter of adding up sunken steel or counting the names of lost ships. The real, fatal blow to the Imperial Japanese Navy lay in what those vessels represented on an industrial spreadsheet, a specialized, irreplaceable maritime infrastructure that Tokyo simply could not manufacture twice. By the spring of 1944, the Pacific War had become an unforgiving race of production, and the numbers were turning sharply against Japan. The United States was launching brand new Essex-class fleet carriers, Independence-class light carriers, attack submarines, and an endless screen of destroyers at a pace that defied naval history. American shipyards were operating like assembly lines, outbuilding the enemy's losses almost as fast as they occurred. Japan was fighting on a completely different industrial plane. The Empire's shipyards were already choked to capacity, just trying to patch damaged combat ships and replace frontline destroyers. They did not have the steel, the skilled labor, or the slipways to quickly rebuild a specialized auxiliary merchant fleet. When an American armor-piercing bomb tore through the keel of a custom-built fleet oiler or a submarine tender in Truk Lagoon, that capability was not just delayed, it was permanently erased from the Empire's order of battle. This reality exposed a bitter, paralyzing paradox for the Japanese high command. Just days before the strike, they had congratulated themselves on successfully evacuating the pride of the combined fleet. The battleships, heavy cruisers, and large aircraft carriers had safely slipped away to Palau, escaping the storm of American aviation. But as the smoke cleared over Truk, the strategic emptiness of that evacuation became impossible to ignore. A dreadnought battleship, safely hidden in Palau, was now strategically paralyzed. Without the specialized oilers to refuel it at sea, without the ammunition ships to restock its magazines, and without the floating workshops to maintain its complex machinery, that capital ship could no longer project power across the Central Pacific. Saving the prestigious warships meant absolutely nothing, because the unglamorous supply vessels required to make them operational had been systematically wiped out. The Japanese naval perimeter had been quietly decapitated. Yet, Admiral Marc Mitscher and the tactical planners of Task Force 58 understood that sinking the auxiliary fleet was only half the equation. If the island installations remained intact, Tokyo might eventually scrape together enough transport tonnage to re-establish a forward logistics hub. To guarantee that Truk could never again serve as a staging ground for the combined fleet, the American strike aircraft turned their attention away from the water and focused on one final, apocalyptic target ashore. The crosshairs shifted from the floating steel of the auxiliary fleet to the fortified coral and concrete of the islands themselves. Up to this point, the American aviators had meticulously disassembled the ships that moved the supplies. Now, they were ordered to vaporize the supplies themselves. Across the small, interconnected islands of Dublin, Eten, and Moen, the Japanese had spent a decade carving a sprawling logistical nervous system directly into the tropical geography. There were vast underground ammunition magazines, expansive repair docks lined with heavy industrial cranes, and, most importantly, the massive cylindrical fuel farms. These tanks held hundreds of thousands of gallons of highly refined aviation gasoline and heavy bunker crude. It was the largest single concentration of energy in the Central Pacific, the literal fuel required to project the Japanese Empire's defensive perimeter. In the final hours of Operation Hailstone, Task Force 58 unleashed its heavy ordnance directly into this stockpiled energy. SBD Dauntless dive bombers and TBF Avengers, armed with incendiaries and delayed fuse high explosives, plummeted toward the fuel farms on Dublin Island. When the bombs pierced the steel roofing of the massive storage tanks, the resulting detonations were not standard military explosions. They were cataclysmic chemical eruptions. Millions of gallons of combustible liquid ignited almost simultaneously. Massive, churning fireballs rolled violently upward, expanding into towering columns of dense, oily black smoke that reached thousands of feet into the equatorial sky. The sheer volume of the smoke was so thick and heavy that it physically blotted out the sun across the atoll. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the blinding glare of the tropical daylight was completely choked off, plunging the lagoon into a surreal, burning twilight. The heat radiating from the shores was so intense that American pilots flying thousands of feet above the islands could feel the temperature spike inside their cockpits. Simultaneously, the American strikes hammered the island infrastructure. Heavy armor-piercing bombs found the subterranean ammunition dumps. When these magazines blew, the explosions triggered sympathetic detonations that ripped through the coral bedrock. Whole sections of the coastline seemingly vanished in blinding flashes of light, followed by shock waves that violently shook the remaining Japanese defenders inside their deep concrete command bunkers. Ashore, the expansive repair docks, the vital dry docks, the specialized machine shops, the heavy foundries used to forge replacement parts for battleship engines were systematically pulverized into twisted, unrecognizable heaps of smoking iron. The physical tools required to sustain a modern navy were being ground into dust. For the Japanese high command observing the annihilation through the narrow slits of their surviving bunkers, the psychological impact was devastating. They were not just watching fires burn, they were watching the geographical reach of the Imperial Japanese Navy evaporate. Every exploding fuel tank and shattered repair dock represented a permanent contraction of their defensive perimeter. The mechanical arteries that connected the bustling armament factories of the Japanese home islands to the sprawling oceanic battlefront had been brutally and irreversibly severed. The realization settling into the command staff was absolute. The mighty combined fleet, wherever its surviving dreadnoughts and carriers were currently hiding, had just been structurally crippled. Without a functional Truk Atoll to act as a forward logistical anchor, Japanese warships could no longer afford to operate for extended periods in the Central Pacific. They simply did not have the fuel to get there, the ammunition to fight once they arrived, or the repair facilities to patch their wounds before heading home. Having expended their ordnance and systematically dismantled the operational heart of the enemy's oceanic infrastructure, the American aviators turned their planes back toward the open sea. By the late afternoon of February 18, 1944, the relentless, deafening roar of radial engines that had terrorized the lagoon for 2 unbroken days finally began to fade. Vice Admiral Marc Mitscher recovered his final strike groups. The massive flight decks of Task Force 58 secured their aircraft. The fleet turned its bows into the prevailing wind, and the sprawling American armada quietly steamed eastward, disappearing back into the vast blue horizon. They left behind a landscape that defied comprehension. The 48-hour storm had ended, but the silence that followed was entirely unnatural, broken only by the crackle of island-wide fires and the groaning of sinking steel. When the heavy black smoke finally began to clear and the sun returned to the lagoon, the landscape of the Pacific War had fundamentally changed. Truk Atoll had not been captured, but it had been definitively killed as a naval hub. As the surviving Japanese troops cautiously emerged from their subterranean bunkers into the suffocating, ash-choked air, they instinctively braced for the next logical phase of the attack. By every metric of Pacific warfare they had experienced so far, a pre-invasion bombardment of this unprecedented scale meant only one thing: an amphibious assault was imminent. Tens of thousands of elite Imperial soldiers manned their coastal artillery batteries, locked their machine guns into the concrete pillboxes overlooking the beaches of Dublin and Moen, and prepared to bleed the Americans for every inch of coral. They were heavily entrenched, highly disciplined, and fully prepared to fight to the death. But as they stared out across the shattered, oil-slicked waters of the lagoon, the horizon remained completely empty. The anticipated armada of American landing craft never materialized. No United States Marines ever plunged through the surf. The American fleet had simply vanished over the eastern horizon, leaving the massive Japanese garrison untouched in its trenches. This was the profound, agonizing paradox that defined the aftermath of Operation Hailstone. The United States Navy had not conquered Truk Atoll. They had not wiped it off the map, nor had they physically erased the Japanese troops defending it. The sprawling island fortress remained geographically intact and firmly under Imperial control. Yet, it had been completely hollowed out. Admiral Raymond Spruance and the American High Command had realized a cold, ruthless truth about modern industrial warfare. A naval fortress only matters if it has utility. It is only dangerous if it can safely shelter a fleet, pump aviation fuel, repair damaged hulls, and project offensive power outward. Once Task Force 58 incinerated the fuel reserves and sank the auxiliary fleet, Truk instantly lost its reason to exist. The American commanders looked at the heavily fortified beaches and made a simple, pragmatic calculation. Bypassing the island was vastly more efficient than conquering it. Why expend the lives of thousands of Marines to capture a logistical hub that no longer had any logistics left to offer? For the nearly 40,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors left behind, the psychological reality of this strategic abandonment was devastating. They had been transformed overnight from the guardians of the Empire's most vital forward staging ground into prisoners of their own impregnable walls. They were heavily armed, fully combat capable, and utterly irrelevant to the rest of the war. They were left to guard a nautical graveyard, staring out at an empty ocean, waiting for an attack the Americans knew they never had to launch. Without the specialized merchant ships to bring in regular provisions, the invincible garrison was simply left to slowly starve in isolation. The enemy had calculated that the jungle and the vastness of the Pacific would do the work of a siege without costing a single American life. The Gibraltar of the Pacific still stood exactly where it always had, but its fundamental purpose had been entirely inverted. The sprawling lagoon that was designed to protect the combined fleet had become the one place on the map the Japanese Navy could never safely return to. In the end, the smoking ruin of Operation Hailstone proved that concrete bunkers and coral reefs cannot win an industrial war. For decades, naval architects and admirals believed that a stronghold was defined by the thickness of its armor and the sheer volume of its coastal artillery. Truk Atoll possessed both in overwhelming abundance, yet it was systematically dismantled in just 48 hours by an enemy that understood a far more ruthless mathematics. The United States Navy did not just neutralize a geographic coordinate. They fundamentally shattered the illusion of the impregnable sanctuary. The great tragedy for the men left staring out at the empty horizon was the realization that their fortress had not actually failed them in combat. It had simply been turned off. A base explicitly built to project the fearsome might of an empire across the globe was ultimately reduced to a silent monument of its own creeping defeat, left behind in the dark as the war violently accelerated toward Tokyo.